Good morning, Tehila. Thank you very much for giving your time to the Mint to talk about the solidarity economy.
Thank you so much, Henry, for having me.
And welcome to Oxford, where I believe you've just moved, which is fantastic.
Thank
So,
you.
if we start, can you give a sort of brief explanation of what you see? What is the solidarity economy? What does that sort of mean?
Yes, of course. So, I mean, the book really kind of looks at a phenomena which today might be called solidarity economy or forms of ethical capitalism. So, ideas about connecting um, ethical values of solidarity, mutual aid, cooperative could be part of it, fellowship, human fellowship, with a certain type of accumulation. So, I mean, capitalism is really the type of economy that I'm talking about. And it could be fair trade. It could be corporate social responsibility. I'm just going to try and make it kind of more concrete rather than like this kind of abstract ideas. But I'm really interested in a certain type of like phenomena that developed over the past maybe 100 years in one way or another that try to connect ideas and ethical values about solidarity, about mutual aid, about fellowship, about cooperative, about fairness, about equality, with a certain type of economic transactions and certain type of regimes of accumulation. So again, capitalism and not just any type of economy. So that's a sort of framework that I start from and that I'm curious about. I'm trying to understand how can the economy and how can capitalist economy be more fair, and how did people in the past, I'm a historian, so how did people in the past thought about how it could be more fair, and what kind of solutions and programs that they devise in order to make a certain type of economy that would connect people and would transcend kind of the process of alienation, which is what kind of the normal critique of capitalism is.
So, what are the sort of key thinkers? Where did these intellectual ideas come from of making capitalism, if you like, nicer, isn't it, or better? Or...
Right. So there's various origins of this, and my book doesn't try to be exhaustive of all origins. I'm a historian, so I locate one particular moment that I think is really important. And I'm a historian of Britain, so I look at the British kind of world in general. And one of the things that I located is that in the 1950s, there were various types of conversations within British socialism, within the British left, that were trying to rethink the capitalist economy without completely moving to communism, so without completely kind of negating it, trying to think of it in more ethical terms. What does ethical means in this sense? They thought of how can we organize the economy in a way that will not be just hyper individual, but also will not just focus on growth. So there were critics of GNP, GDP. They were critics of this kind of metrics that just focuses on growth, and instead something that would see people, see communities. Community was a very important term for them, but would not fall into hyper individualism. So the 1950s is a really important moment for me. I look at economists like Michael Young, which I mean, a lot of people I think, not economists, sorry, politicians like Michael Young, which a lot of people would, of course, know, as well as economists. I mean, probably the most important economist for my book is E.F. Schumacher. So he was the advisor of the National Coal Board. He worked very closely with this kind of form of public ownership. It was part of the welfare state that was created after the Second World War. He was very invested in it, but he saw limits to it. He thought of the focus on this kind of metrics of growth as very limiting, and so he turned to various types of solutions, mostly in the East. He traveled to India and to Burma. So he discovered Gandhi and various types of economic thinking that looked at different types of economic activities that focused on community development primarily and were environmental, were ecological, and did not just, again, focus on this kind of modernization theory, large projects of growth, as it were. So this is like one of the origins that I'm locating. Discussions in the 1950s about ideas of organizing the economy beyond public ownership, which was the kind of more classical way.
And I think this is, for me, this is really interesting because often people looking back now sort of say the 50s and the 60s, and maybe a bit of the 70s were the golden years when we had economic growth. It was all going very well. And then, of course, the neoliberals came in with Thatcher and Reagan and destroyed it all, and we're suffering ever after from that. And if only these golden years had continued, everything would be fine. But if I'm saying it right, you're saying actually within the so-called golden years, these were the dissidents, if you like, or the people who were critiquing it, who saw flaws in it. And what were the sort of flaws they saw in the sort of Keynesian consensus, if you like, post-war?
Right. I mean, I think that's very correct. So one of the things that I'm working against as a historian is to kind of dismantle or complicate this idea that there was this golden years and then there were the bad years, and to show that there is a more complex way of understanding the post-war period, the 50s and the 60s in particular, by looking at various types of ideas. These are not ideas that I'm necessarily dismissing, by the way. I think that there were a lot of good things about these ideas, and a lot of them became the origins of conversations in the 90s that, influenced New Labor. A lot of them influence also today people like Ed Miliband, I think, so like, it's not like they're not completely disconnected, but the way that they were put into practice maybe is a bit more problematic. But the idea was that Keynesian economic, or this kind of focus on just the growth metric, sort of ignores certain people in the community. So it doesn't see people and individuals, not individuals just as like atoms, but sort of as part of a community, and I think we can connect with that, this idea that only those metrics of growth really focus on one part of a very large part, or just one part of our national community. And instead, we need to look at various types of marginal communities that might not be included in it. So I think that was part of the critique. The critique was also about the fact that it's environmentally not very productive to have this kind of metric, that there's ways in which we should think about the relationship between the economy and the environment in a way that will not just plow through it, like again, I don't know if I'm being like specific enough, but I think that, these ideas that we think about them, and a lot of this critique was basically critique of looking at the state. A critique of looking at the state as the only way of organizing the economy. And instead, people like Schumacher talked about a certain type of decentralization. And so organizing the economy in a much more hyper-localized way around communities. So instead of having big modernization projects, which was what the kind of classical way of Keynesian economic model was, instead of just like investing a lot of money in big factories in order to boost growth, we need to look at various and empower various communities and teach them how, this kind of self-help kind of idea, and teach them how to help themselves. The idea was both about Britain itself as well as about the global South, or the post-colonial economies that were becoming independent in that time. So the stakes were very high at this time of how you're going to organize the new economies of places like India, places like Kenya. And so that's sort of the general critique that these people are looking at, and they're not thinking about it in the same way that we would think today about neoliberalism, like as conservative critique of the state, but they were critiquing the state from the left. They were thinking about certain type of anti-statism in a way that the state does not see those individuals and communities, and we need to create something that is much more British. I mean, they saw it as this kind of like a British version of capitalism that is people-centered development, they called it.
So I'd like to then talk more then about how this was put into practice. So I think this is fascinating. And actually, funny enough, I was involved in community business development in the early 90s. So I suppose I can sort of relate to that. But tell me about who picked up these ideas and tried to turn them into reality, if you like.
Right. So there's a lot of people that picked up these ideas, but the main protagonist for my story that I'm looking at that I think is really important are different types of nonprofits in Britain, and particularly non-government organizations, international aid organizations like Oxfam, Save the Children, Christian Aid, Born Want, and Schumacher's own development program, nonprofit, which was called Intermediate Development Technology Group.
And what did so they know they want to create community connections, etc. How did they go about doing that?
Yeah, so in the 1960s and the 1970s, a lot of these nonprofits, and maybe the largest one is Oxfam for this story, pick up on a lot of these ideas. They read. I mean, I kind of worked in the archives. You look at their bibliography and what they read. They read these people. They read people like Schumacher. They read people like Barbara Ward also. So different types of economists trying to think about their place in the global economy and how they can sort of intervene in the global economy during this period of decolonization and to help create a certain type of more ethical economy or solidarity markets. They actually use that term. This is where I kind of draw the term solidarity economy, because some Oxfam people even use the term solidarity markets. So they want to create a certain type of more equal, egalitarian markets that would connect consumers and producers from the global north and the global south, or from Britain and India, let's say, directly without the intervention of the state or big kind of trade agreements, so even without the international trading system, and instead we connect them through various types of fair trade. This is the origins of what in the late 80s became the kind of marker of the label of fair trade. So to create various types of fair trade programs that would connect consumers and producers and would allow a certain type of solidarity markets to transcend the type of inequality that is already written within the global economy. That's at least the aspiration. I mean, it doesn't exactly work like that, but as a historian, I take them seriously and I analyze them, and I look at the different types of programs and how they try to implement ideas about community development and critique of Keynesian economics, through these various types of development programs they created.
A key one you talk about, I think, is sort of crafts, supporting groups to create local crafts that are meant to be linked to the place, etc., and then selling them over here. Is that right? How did that work then? How did they actually?
Right. So one of the programs that I look at focuses on the handicraft market. And particularly Oxfam was sort of a novice in this field. What they tried to do in the late 1960s and throughout the 70s is to create a program. They called it the Bridge program. That was a program that was supposed to bridge consumers in Britain and producers in the global south through various types of cooperatives and development programs, and connect them through partially through the vast networks of charity shops that they created. So charity shops, we think of them as something that is very hyper localized, hyper British, but actually it became, kind of the origins of this kind of larger fair trade networks, because they became this kind of space in which Oxfam and other types of charities later on could start importing different types of craft. So Oxfam would invest certain types of money and even send different types of field workers and experts to work with various types of cooperatives and communities in the global south. They would train them in how to create various types of crafts. Have purses, bags, clothes. Then they would import these handicrafts, first to the charity shops, and then they worked with various types of like exporting companies to distribute this in Britain and Europe and in North America. But it was first for, the charity shops. And then they will sell them, and they will sell them to the British consumer under the promise of this is a way for you to participate and help somebody, a particular person directly in the global south by buying their product. So it was kind of like very physical, material way of helping somebody without giving them charity, but really kind of participating in a certain type of exchange, certain type of like solidarity economy by buying something that would both be useful to you as a consumer, as well as produce a certain type of value to the producer.
And these, essentially, so they train them to do handicrafts, because I suppose the person buying it in an Oxfam shop might think this is the sort of things that these people in India or whatever are producing anyway, and they're sort of buying something authentic in some sense.
Yeah.
How did they make? I mean, was this a faux authenticism in a way?
In some places it was, I don't think it was completely inauthentic, but there were various things that I found in the archives which are very interesting, in which they trained some producers in hentai, for example, or encouraged producers to include a certain type of note that talks about the production and how it connects to a certain type of local craft. So, I mean, what various types of nonprofits did is that they, and particularly Oxfam was very good at it, is to train producers to market themselves as third world producers by either training them in creating different types of so-called authentic, what they thought as authentic handicrafts, or encouraging them to just focus on a certain niche of those handicrafts and not, for example, expand to other types of production of goods, but to just focus on a certain type of like cloth or a certain type of fabrics that would then be marketed as this kind of authentic craft. So in a way, this fair trade market that today we think of as this kind of very kind of ethnic way of shopping and participating in somebody else's culture was marketed as something that was supposed to be I don't know, like a sort of authentic type of craft and a way of like connecting to somebody's kind of local culture.
And what did the people who were actually doing it, that they recruited or worked with, get out of it? What possibilities did they face, and was this actually helpful for them? Was this a good thing or not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I want to kind of caveat this by saying I don't think that all fair trade is like this. So these are just like the type of programs, again, that are very much the origins of fair trade. So they're maybe a way of rethinking how we frame fair trade today, rather than saying all fair trade is tainted by this history. But one of the things that I found in the archives was that a lot of these programs, so the idea was to create a certain type of intermediate technologies. That's what they call them. Certain type of technologies that are very local, like to train producers in a sort of very, very localized, low technology kind of stakes of like either producing different types of irrigation programs or producing stuff that could then be later sold, like different types of handicrafts or even fair trade of food. And some of these cooperatives already existed, and these nonprofits were basically investing in them. But what they did is that once they started investing in them and creating this kind of solidarity market, they ended up like in many places not really paying them properly, so the wages were not great. A lot of field reporters came back, a lot of field directors came back and reported that the working conditions were not very good, that people worked over hours, they weren't paid properly, there wasn't like proper limitation there. And Oxfam, decided to kind of like brushed it off a lot of times, and or not just Oxfam, but a lot of these nonprofits would brush it off and would sort of like blame, the producers themselves and the conditions in which they produced it. So it wasn't necessarily that helpful for a lot of these communities. What they got out of this kind of model, specifically of the Bridge program, was that Oxfam would take, would take the handicraft, would then sell it in those charity shops, and then they would keep the money and distribute it as different types of money for aid programs. Okay, so in many ways, this kind of global market, solidarity market, was not necessarily giving money directly back to the communities, but it was giving indirectly money to other communities for more development programs. So it was a way to fund development overall, globally, rather than a way to kind of help producers gain funding, direct funding for their labor. What I do is I follow the various types of schemes and ideas of how Oxfam thought of creating this and what ended up happening, which is what I just told you, which is Oxfam keeping a lot of the money in their own hands and then distributing it as different types of money for development programs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so they presumably they did actually pay for them a certain amount for them, but in terms of the profit as such, or
yeah, but it wasn't a way of like, really generating huge amount of revenue, right? So that they paid for it through aid, but they gave them a certain lump for aid, but it wasn't, instead of, so one of the things I look at is that, in late 60s, Oxfam entertained an idea where they would put some of these producers on the board for their Bridge program,
right,
and would allow these producers to really kind of also get much more of the profit from these products. But they decided not to do that. They decided to sort of keep the control in their own hand and to kind of be the representatives. They thought this was not like a really practical way of putting all producers, on the board. And so they decided to keep control in their own hands. And then, they used a lot of the kind of revenue that came out of these products to kind of to be put in a larger pot of money for more development aid programs rather than directly benefit. So, when we buy something, in fair trade kind of production, we think, or at least the kind of illusion of it, or the kind of idea behind it was that this would be a great way to support one specific individual producer. And the reality was that this producer didn't necessarily get all the money that we put towards that item, but the money went to a third party, which was a nonprofit, which would then decide to distribute the money in various types of other aid programs. You know what I mean? So that's sort of what I'm going with that.
I mean, you could argue for as a way to go, but I suppose if I get it right, what you're sort of saying is that the issue is maybe more here who was making the decisions and who had the control, over how this was done. And
right. So I mean, the idea itself, the aspiration itself, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's something really interesting about it, and the impulse behind it is something that I think a lot of people can connect with. I think the problem was that it was completely unregulated, right? So the problem is that because these are all schemes that are set up to work on purpose against the state in many ways, or like beyond, maybe not against, but beyond the state, beyond any type of supervision, beyond any type of like clear regulation, you're leaving you're trusting the nonprofit and the trust, the nonprofit itself to decide and make decisions of how to distribute the money. So the nonprofit becomes this kind of stakeholder, and that's the kind of idea of a certain type of stakeholder capitalism. They become the stakeholder of both the producers, the consumers, the larger community, and they decide what is ethical. That opens up some problems.
Yeah.
That opens up some problems when you have certain type of unregulation for different types of trade programs. I mean, some of the programs I look at are also programs for corporate social responsibility. So some of them are collaboration with the for-profit world, you know. So I mean, so there's clear like interest there, you know. So like, how do you regulate this? That's a question.
And this also then moved on, you said, to focus on microfinance later. How did that sort of transition happen from that sort of fair trade to get more of a focus on
Right. So
microfinance?
a lot of the turn to the fair trade programs in the 70s came from a broader critique that was very popular to create a new international economic order during the period of decolonization. But by the early 1980s, a lot of the post-colonial economies that were launching this critique for a new international economic order were ridden with debt, and that became like a huge problem. And so structural adjustment programs became very popular. A lot of these nonprofits that I look at, you know, became real kind of critics of structural adjustment programs, again, because it fitted the general critique that they were part of, which is we shouldn't look at this kind of top-down programs that don't really see people. They end up just contributing to poverty rather than solving poverty. And so we need to find a different solution. And one of the solutions that they turned towards was what they call adjustment with a human face. And it was microfinance. So it was, instead of giving money, you know, instead of having this kind of like bailouts for the national economy, having different types of investments in people and their families through these various types of microfinance. Now, British NGOs, of course, did not invent microfinance. That's something, you know, that they added into, like, they sort of became part of a larger movement or a larger turn towards microfinance. But what they did is they took a lot of these fair trade programs that they already had, and they sort of financialized them. So instead of giving money and running a program or a cooperative directly themselves in Gujarat, they decided to give and to fund either different types of NGOs in India, or to directly give different types of investments in people that became, you know, suddenly entrepreneurs. So the idea was to kind of, invest in people themselves and make them entrepreneurs, make them run their own kind of fair trade programs, if you want to call it like that.
And you sort of say that this sort of strand of thinking has been and continues maybe to be key to, I suppose, giving a support to neoliberalism, or making, you know, so going back to that initially, how we were saying, you know, that the narrative that there was the good old days, the golden years, and then we had neoliberalism is bad, but actually you argue that this type of solidarity economy gave some sort of cover, greenwash neoliberalism, supported, or what? What do you see exactly the relationship between the continuation, I suppose, of neoliberalism and the solidarity economy idea?
So I guess what I'm trying to do is to say we think of neoliberalism as a purely conservative story that was, you know, was created by Thatcher, maybe had some origins before that with, you know, the different types of programs in Britain that were already created by her Wilson to sell council houses and stuff. But, you know, but it was mostly, we normally associate this with the conservative government of the 80s and with Thatcher. And with a certain type of, you know, there's various types of traits that we think of when we think of it neoliberalism: anti-statism, individualism, entrepreneurship. So, you know, these traits are not necessarily just conservative and are not necessarily just like the neoliberal conservative program that we think of. That's sort of my argument. My argument is that a lot of these ideas of anti-statism or suspicious of the state, a lot of ideas about individualism, which we really associate with neoliberalism, and entrepreneurship, were not necessarily something that belonged only to the conservative right, not necessarily to the type of conservative neoliberalism that we associate with the 80s, but had their origins and developed through these various types of programs and through ideas that came from the left. That doesn't mean that everything, that came from the left is tainted with that, but it means that we need to think about what do we actually say, when we talk about entrepreneurship and individualism, and to think of who helped facilitate it and how can we maybe rethink it, or yeah. So that's sort of like the idea behind it is that, so one of the things I look at, just to kind of make it maybe more concrete and to tie it to what I said, is that, a lot of these bridge programs that then became financialized through microfinance really encourage entrepreneurship. But the idea was not the same. The idea came from like Schumacher, from people of the left, that, entrepreneurship is something very positive and something that belongs to left-wing economics because it allows producers to become the owner of their own labor. So, I mean, it's not necessarily the same type of programs that Thatcher would create later on in the mid-1980s that would encourage entrepreneurship as a way to solve unemployment because she didn't want to invest in certain type of unemployment benefits. I mean, it came from a different place, but it ended up meeting in the same.
And is that, you talk about at the end, you say the solidarity economy gave a false promise. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, by false promise, I mean, I think that I particularly look and think of the idea of consumerism. So a lot of these programs put a lot of emphasis on the consumer and the Western consumer as a way of solving a lot of these problems. So fair trade of food, fair trade of handicraft, of corporate social responsibility. That maybe not about consumers, but a way of fixing the economy by making corporations become, ethical agents, by moving away from the state and from any type of like structural solutions to much more individual solutions, either by looking at individual corporations or individual consumers. I think it gave a certain false promise, maybe a promise that we have still today, that we can, as individuals, fix the economy and make it more ethical, rather than that we need to empower certain much more larger structures to manage it, and to fix its problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you sort of saying that we have to revisit the state in a way, and what
Yeah.
the state does, which is sort of interesting if we look at people like Mariana Mazzucato, and we have a mission-driven government, and the idea of missions where the state is a entrepreneur and trying to deliver outcomes. So I wonder if that, do you think the solidarity economy idea is still alive and kicking, or is the uh, um, you know is there maybe a move to rediscover the state and reinvent the state?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think that I don't know if I can answer this. Again, I'm a historian.
Yeah, no,
So
absolutely.
I don't want to find myself in like uncharted terrains.
But
Um,
essentially, you did at one point, as a historian, say that that neoliberalism is continuing. It's everyone
yeah.
says it's dying, but it doesn't seem to be dying. And part of that you put down, I suppose, to the ongoing ideas of the solidarity economy. But I suppose maybe 20 years time you come back when now has been written and as history.
Yeah, and
Uh,
revisit the current government to see what.
but I think it's really useful. I think this to I suppose to refocus and reflect on where we need to go. And at the moment, I suppose, there's this big debate between, on the one hand, greening the economy versus degrowth, and this. I suppose there's always been over history this sort of divide between people who want more fundamental change to the whole system versus people who are trying to make bits of the system better.
Right. I mean, a lot of these ideas of degrowth and conversation about growth came from this moment in the 1950s. And so I think that it is worth revisiting them to understand their origins, where they come from, what politics through that they carry, what's at stake. I think it kind of helps kind of unpack the ideas that we're using today, if it makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, I would recommend everyone to read your book because I find it absolutely fascinating, giving a new insight and a new angle, which I think we really have to take seriously, because otherwise there is this slightly more simplistic story, isn't it, that dominates. So thank you very much, Tehila, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
I look forward to talking further about these really interesting topics.
Yeah, thank you so much, Henry, and to the Mint for the interview.